The Bunker Project Special Report, a university study on podcasting.
Hi, everybody, and as you can tell by the sound of our intro, is a special report. I have Andrew on the line, my special co-host, and Alan Middleton, and I'm just going to hand it over to Andrew, and he's going to do most of the interview, and I promise not to jump in too much.
All right. Well, this is a interesting interview because we're actually talking to Alan Middleton, who is an Ohio State University associate professor in Lancaster. Is it?
Yep, I have to say it is Ohio University, which is not the same as Ohio State University.
Ah, okay. So Ohio University.
Ohio University. My employer would kill me if I didn't correct that.
And and you actually did a study on podcasting.
Yeah, I did. I was interested just, in I'd heard, I'm a huge fan of podcasting, let me start there, and just audio in general. And I'd heard just podcasters just in the course of their show making sort of assumptions about their audience, or when and where they thought their audience listened, comments like, well, we need to keep this short because people only listen in their car, or just things like that, really, but without any data at all to back that up. And so I thought, well, here's a opportunity to do some academic work as well as maybe doing some useful practical work to gather some of that information about.
Guys, sorry, I've just got to jump in there. I just realized I had my thing on pause. This is something Andrew does every now and then. It's my turn.
It's all right. I've got it on record. So
what do you want to?
We can just we'll keep going and then we can just hit record now. And we can put it together after. It's fine.
Okay. All right.
Fix it in post.
Exactly.
Yeah, if you've been listening to the show, that's happened several times. Usually it's my fault. That's one of the perils of doing podcasting and mixing it with alcohol.
Well, that must make those live shows interesting too.
Yeah, for sure.
When you're doing it on the fly.
Yep, absolutely. Live to hard drive. That's what we like to do.
Exactly.
But yeah. So the first time I heard you was actually on GSPN, the podcast Answer Man. Cliff Ravenscraft talked about your study. That was
right. I wanted to. Yeah, I wanted to. I mean, I was sitting and I had what I thought was a pretty interesting idea. I just needed people to take the survey, and at the point I had I still have no Facebook, and at the point I had maybe 140 Twitter followers. So I was going to have to rely on social media and podcasters themselves, people who took the survey, to get the word out. And I ended up with almost 1,000 responses. So people like Cliff. I thought that was a great place to start. I was involved in the GSPN community to some extent, and knew that obviously the podcast Answer Man, a show listened to by a number of podcasters, was sort of the perfect place to start getting some responses. And you filled out the survey, Andrew.
Yeah, I filled out the survey. And I'm actually a GSPN Plus member, and so I filled out that survey. And then when you sent back the results, I'm like, wow, this is pretty cool. So I sent you an email. It was quite a while back, kind of going back and forth to get the interview done because, pretty busy these days. But but yeah, no, it's the results look really interesting. Do you think that things as the tablets are coming out and the Playbook and Zoom and the iPad, do you think these are going to change the metrics a little bit?
They could. I see maybe the future of podcasting might be through apps. So any place that apps, there are a couple of podcasts that I listen to, via the Twit app, No Agenda app, a couple others. And, I wonder if, I don't know how it is in Canada, but in U.S., the American iTunes store has a reputation of being pretty hard to navigate. And I've heard Leo Laporte talk about it. There is sort of a high bar that it's not like radio where I can push a button and get a station. There's a little bit of work you have to do between searching for a podcast, finding it, and searching and finding through the iTunes store is not easy. And then you have to I mean, even something simple as you see the word subscribe, and you always apply you always I think think of the word you think that means I'm going to have to pay something, so I don't want to hit that button, and if I do hit that button, then I have to sync, and if I wait a few episodes, it stops downloading. There's a lot of I'm used to it. I don't think it's complex at this point, but it certainly can be overwhelming or intimidating.
That's true, because I know somebody who said he just sampled the Bunker Project on iTunes and didn't just got the free episodes and didn't subscribe. And I'm like, wait a minute, they're all free. Just go ahead and subscribe.
Exactly. Yeah. So I wonder if apps might be a way of getting around that.
Well, Bob uses Pocket Casts. On his on his Android phone, and that downloads the podcast direct, or you can stream it. Bypasses any kind of on computer podcatcher. It's just direct to his phone.
I mean, what I would love to see. I'm not an engineer, so I'll just take 50% of the cut of whoever invents this. Is some sort of radio-like device that instead of putting in frequencies, you preset some sort of stream or some app device just to make it easier for the non-techies, to make it a little bit easier to find, and so that's I'd love to see something to make it easier for for folks who have that intimidation factor. I just think podcast is it's a great medium.
Mm-hmm. That's true. So let's go over some of the results that you got in this in the study, and which one surprised you the most, and if it met what you expected when you got into this. The first one is 76% of respondents listen to most often to the podcast on an iPod or MP3 player, and that one I was totally not surprised at all.
No.
That's the way that most people I listen, because it's portable media.
Right. Exactly.
And that's part of the
Yeah, I just want to jump in here. When you say the MP3 player, does that also include phones?
That was up to people to interpret it. I meant to include phones, and I think that's obviously going to be a much more and as Andrew said, the tablets, all of those are going to be convergence devices where all of these various features, whether it's the phone and the GPS and the game player and the music player and the podcast player, all of this converging into one or two devices. So that specifically, that question was up to the interpretation of the person filling out the survey, but I assume that includes phones as well. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I interpreted it as kind of like just MP3 player being a mobile player,
right?
Whether it's in a phone or not. It's interesting though, because I'll bring that up in a minute. But the next result was 70% of respondents download their podcast via the iTunes store, and that's I think that was accurate for us up until we registered in the BlackBerry podcast.
Great.
Yeah, because now we're getting more than 30%. Just looking at our Libsyn stats, more than 30% of our listeners now are coming through on Blackberries.
Yeah, remember this the active data collection phase of this was spring of 2010. So that may be biased towards what was popular and dominant at that time.
Mm-hmm. Because I think they just launched their BlackBerry podcast app around that time or shortly after that time,
Mm-hmm.
and it didn't really, it wasn't like natively there. You'd have to actually be searching for it to get it, but now you can. Now it's just there, and in the playbook, it's pretty prominent. You can just uh, click on podcast or touch podcast, and then there you go. You can do searches and featured and all that. And I think we must have got featured because when we shortly after we signed up, we were getting like 50% of our downloads were happening on the BlackBerry. Now it's tapered off to about 30%. So
Yeah, that's one of those mysteries also, how you get featured. Or, I've heard podcasters comment, we've been on for a year and we ended up in new and notable or something, and it just sort of how that happens. There's such serendipity
yeah,
about whether you get there or not. And I assume it's probably like, the Twitter recommended followers. If you're there, you're gonna get clicked on. And if you're not there, there's things are tough to find.
yeah, we were on new and notable for a while, but I've looked recently in the new and notable, and I'm like, well, that podcast might be notable, but it's definitely not
That
new.
that's true. That's
There's some
true.
out there that are not new. Yeah, and so we got 28% of people listening in the car, and 28% listening at home during the week. And
I thought that was pretty interesting. I thought, like I said, sort of just listening to podcasters talk about, well, we need to keep this at 30 minutes because everyone just listens in their car. And I actually, heard a comment like that a couple of times, and I'm, listening at work or listening at home and thinking, I'm not listening in my car right now. I'm only in my car, an hour a day, and I'm at work or at home many more hours a day listening to audio and podcasts. So, that was at home during the week and commuting. Were both at 28%. I think the question was, what's the most common place that you listen? And then right beyond that, at 24% was at work.
I've started to
It's
do
also
that actually as well because especially with This Week in Google and This Week in Tech, it's relevant to what we do in the telecommunications business. So it's actually a good fit to throw. I mean, of course, a lot of podcasts wouldn't be, but they're talking about Android phones and iPhones and all that, so it's a good fit for
Absolutely.
for what I do. But yeah, and the median preferred length of a podcast episode is 46 minutes, which yeah, I agree with that. There's a lot of podcasts out there. This Week in Tech is one that's can be an hour and a half or close to 2 hours long, and that's that's great content. So I listen to it, but for the most part,
Right.
I'd be shying away from a podcast that long, I think.
Yeah, I asked two questions about that. I think one was, what's your preferred length? I think that's the one you're referencing. I also asked if you have a favorite podcast, how long on average does it go? And that number was about 10 minutes longer.
Okay.
And it sort of tells me that, yeah, I prefer something shorter, but I'm willing to listen to something that may have been, a preponderance of No Agenda and This Week in Tech, longer podcasts. But I think one of the neat thing about podcasting in general, compared to say traditional radio, is the ability to, if you think about a show being about an hour, if that's your goal and you run out of content at 48 minutes, that's okay. You can end the show at 48 minutes. Or if the show is going to be, if you're having a great conversation, the show needs to go to 66 minutes, you can do that too. That flexibility that's inherent as opposed to, traditional radio, or, if you think about TV or something where it has to be in these, radio is, a series of 6-minute segments almost, where you have to have a hard out at this exact moment. And in the course of an hour, there might be 34 minutes of actual content or something, and it can't be 33. We'd have to fill it to get to 34, and it certainly can't be 35 because we need to play the weather and the commercials.
You got to get the commercials in at a set time, and
yeah, but to have to have that flexibility where a This Week in Tech maybe averages an hour and a half, but it can go an hour 45 if it needs to, or an hour 25 if it needs to. I think that flexibility. I've heard some podcasters who've come from radio talk about the flexibility, both of the long form, way of having a conversation.
Well, I think with This Week in Tech, though, they've got if they do an hour and 50 minutes, about half an hour of that is advertising.
I don't think it's that much, but it does seem that way, doesn't it?
Yeah, like the first 5 or 6 minutes is all brought to you by.
If you're not listening to the live stream, we know you can just scan ahead a minute or two.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, yeah. No, it's a great show, and actually, I don't mind that part. I can, like you said, I can fast forward, or I can just tune that out for a little bit and do my work and keep going, and then tune it back in when I hear something interesting.
As a listener of podcasts, I like having sort of in my queue, some hour podcasts or some 25-minute podcasts, or if it's a weekend and I don't have much to do, that's when I can throw on a 2-hour podcast. I like having that variety, as opposed to if I'm going to sit down and watch a TV show. Well, if it's a drama, it's going to be an hour, or a comedy is always going to be 30 minutes. I just like having that variety.
Mm-hmm. And the categories that were most popular in your study were technology, comedy, news and politics, society and culture, and arts and leisure. Is that in order?
Yeah, I used that, and I used those definitions from the American iTunes Store. It's where I got those category names, and so there were a few people taking the survey, coming from other places, had a bit of a hard time figuring out what exactly, where a podcast would fit. But yeah. Yes, it's in that order, and those were all pretty closely bunched together.
Technology is the number one category in iTunes. Interesting,
right?
Or not in iTunes, but in out of all respondents, they picked technology for whatever.
Yeah, and I think the question was, in the last month, have you listened to any show from this category?
Right.
And 42% of people had listened to a technology show in the last month.
I'm going to jump in here and ask a question. With that category, do you think people are more tuned into technology because they're early adapters and podcasting and listening to podcasts is a relatively new concept?
Yeah, I think that's reasonable to assume that. One of the things that surprised me, I guess, was I did some demographic information, and podcast listeners are an extremely well-educated group, well above average in turn. I think the median was a college graduate, which is well above the regular average population. And so I think, probably that education level, and obviously being tech savvy enough to, to not be intimidated. I mean, if you're using, a personal technology, even at this point, might not be in the early adoption phase, but we're probably still in the early majority phase, where, iPods and iPads, as big as we talk about iPads selling 5 or 6 or 7 million, and that's a huge number. Well, the U.S. and Canada has 350 million people between it. 5, 6, 7, or 8 million iPads, or even 20 or 30 or 40 million iPods is really not that big a number.
Hey, here's something really interesting in your summary of results. In the last year, 68% have participated in a podcast in some way, and 50% have responded to a podcast's revenue model.
Yeah, I asked, in the last year, have you participated? And the examples I gave were, by giving feedback, either calling in or writing in feedback, or participating in the associated chat room or something like that. Now, perhaps that number might be a little bit high because someone who's willing to click on and take a survey might sort of by their nature be more willing to participate in other ways, but that's
Yeah,
still a
because they
very,
are
very high
participating. Yeah.
number.
No, that's a huge number. That's the one that jumped right out at me. And 50% responding to a podcast revenue
Yeah,
model.
50% responding to the revenue model, and that was whether it was donation or, going to, responding to an ad,
Or signing up for
fund.
signing up for a
Yep,
Maven certificate.
exactly. Or yeah, fundraisers, or I mean, those your Maven certificates is a really interesting approach, sort of similar to what Dvorak and Adam Curry do on No Agenda, where if you give a certain amount, your name is listed and you're an executive producer of the show and you get a quote unquote credit. That you're a producer of the show, or you have your name mentioned, and we've learned through things like Farmville and games like this that we respond to silly little incentives like that, as human beings. Not that being a maven is silly,
By
but
the way, for all the listeners, Alan here is our first bunker project maven. He's the research maven.
there
Is
you
that
go.
correct? Research maven.
Exactly. Proud to be.
There you go.
So yeah, so we respond to things like that, and so I'm not surprised that people are willing to, and a lot of the some of the podcasters, Adam Kroll is quite clear about it on his show, where he says, we've got a little bit of a staff here, we've got some expenses, we've got utilities. If you go to Pro Flowers or Audible or whoever the sponsor is for that segment, we're going to get a little bit, and it's going to keep the lights on. And it's a very clear-cut, direct, and transparent, approach. And I think people appreciate that.
Yeah,
And are willing to respond to that.
I agree. I know for myself, I was I really like a lot of the GSPN shows, so I've been contributing to that show as a Plus member, that $10 a month model, and I still do, even though he's now changed that so that all his content is available. But it's a good model.
It's interesting, and I've seen some podcast as Cliff has moved away from the Plus model. I've seen some people moving towards it, and it's still shaking out. I think we're probably still going to end up with quite a variety of different
revenue models.
Different revenue models.
The preferred revenue model from a listener perspective is advertisement or a sponsorship message at the beginning of a show. That's what we've got here in your results.
Right. Right.
I guess I can see that too. You don't have to sign up as a member, What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think advertising is. I mean, we're used to it. If you're comparing an audio podcast, and my focus was audio, obviously video might change this somewhat, but in terms of audio podcasts, and we're used to listening to radio and watching TV and having commercials, as long as they're not intrusive. And I think we mentioned Leo Laporte, and probably his are probably about as close. That might be the maximum. In a 90-minute show, he might have 10%, 9 or 10 minutes of ads. And that might be the max that we can do before it starts feeling intrusive. But most shows with a sponsor at the beginning or the end, that's 30 seconds out of a 45-minute or 60-minute podcast. Not very intrusive at all. And I think it depends what the podcaster themselves. I mean, one of the nice things about podcasts is that the barriers to entry for doing a podcast are so low, in terms of the equipment costs being relatively inexpensive nowadays, and being able to do RSS and so on. I mean, it's hard to get listeners, I guess, but sort of if you're doing it as a hobby, and the cost might be a couple $100 and a couple hours a week
Yeah.
and a little bit of web hosting or something, and if I can get a little bit of sponsorship just to pay that.
Yeah, it's certainly
You know,
the barrier to entry is nothing like it would have been, 10 years ago or 15 years ago. To do something
and
like this and to get it
yeah,
out there to a potential worldwide audience is amazing.
and to be, some of the podcasts I'm a fan of are very niche, and I like that, and you could have an audience of 700 or 800 people, and with a little bit of a sponsorship, you can break even with that,
Mm-hmm.
and
Absolutely.
and be and where no radio station would let you be on the air for more than one episode if you only had 500 or 600 people listening. And
Yeah.
that's 600 or 700 or 800 people worldwide listening to you. But shows can survive and probably even break even with really small audiences if you're going after very narrow niche topics.
Not
Like the
even
combination of technology and beer. If someone could come up with that combination
that would
of
be
a pod,
weird. Black beer,
that would be weird.
black beer. That would be cool. Someone should
especially if,
think of that.
especially if you talked in like Canadian accents or something. It would be
Yeah. Hey, do
totally.
we have Canadian accents?
I,
uh,
let's just say I'm a fan of the Bunker Project, not the Bunker Project, as we would say here.
all
It's the Bunker
right.
Project.
There you go. Yeah. Hey, another thing that's on your list here is that podcasts are found primarily by other podcasters mentioning another show in their program. So I found that
That
interesting because, like, I mean,
that was one that
I do a
I'm
search
sorry. That
in iTunes
yeah.
quite often, but quite often, like most of the podcasts that I'm subscribed to now, I've heard from, say, the Podcast Answer Man or the Audacity to Podcast with Daniel Lewis,
Right.
and Smart Passive Income with Pat Flynn.
Hmm.
A good portion of the podcast I'm listening to at this particular time were mentioned on their shows.
Yeah,
So
I mean, when I found, I did the same thing when I got the last person in my family. I feel like the last person in the United States to get an iPod a couple years ago. The first thing I did, you start at iTunes to do the search, just sort of where to start. But then at that point, sort of like you pointed out, but probably now the majority of the shows I listen to, I probably did discover from listening to other podcasts. And I wouldn't necessarily have thought that, but seeing that survey sort of surprised me at first. But like you said, well, in retrospect, that's probably accurate. And I think that points out one of the really interesting things about podcasting, and I hope it can maintain this character over the years, is that podcasters, again, I'm just a listener, so I mean, you can speak to this as well. Podcasters don't view each other as competitors, but view each other as colleagues.
hmm
And the number of on the comedy podcasts, everybody is on everybody's show. Chris Hardwick is on Adam Carolla's show, and they're on Fitzsimmons' show, and they're on someone else's show, and there's just sort of rotating back and forth of guesting on each other's show, and that's something you would never see in local radio, for example,
Yeah, that's
where if
true.
there are two sports stations in town, they hate each other. If there are two morning drive shows, they spend the time, criticizing the other one. I mean, Howard Stern was never friendly to any of his morning, morning drive competitors.
Yeah,
He was vicious.
absolutely.
He was vicious about his
Yeah, and
morning show
podcasters, I find, like
competitor.
they like to network with other podcasters, and
Absolutely, and I've seen the benefit of that. I think again, when a lot of examples. I mean, you guys talk about other podcasters, glowingly, positively, regularly, and other, there are other podcasts that talk about, like you say, hosts, sharing co-hosts, in some areas, and it's just, something that I really appreciate, sort of that semi-pro amateur. I mean that in the positive way, sort of the hobbyist approach to it. Viewing each other as sort of, we're doing this new thing. We're explorers. We're colleagues. We're not fighting over advertising dollars. And,
Yeah, we're not.
if Cliff Ravenscraft gets a listener, it's not that you've lost one.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is, to a certain extent, it is true that we only have a certain amount of time in our days to listen to podcasts, and if you start listening to one show, you may, kind of put one on hold for a while or whatever. But I'm not worried about that, and I don't think other podcasters are worried about that. And you can only benefit by associating with other podcasters, and it gets your show out there to more people. And if you do lose a listener here and there, it's because they resonate with that show a little bit more than maybe your show, but it's going to go the other way too. And
right.
People can, with podcasts, you can listen and you can stop listening, you can come back, and it's I think it's fine. I'm not worried about that. What do you think, Bob?
Yeah.
Me? Oh, I don't know. I think podcasting is what I used to do when I was younger, and I used to record radio shows so I could listen to them at my leisure. And it's just come around to what I'm finding really interesting is that CBC and some of the other radio stations now, they say, oh, well, you can listen to the podcast if you like.
Yeah.
And they have stripped down shows.
They're going time shifted as well, so you don't have to be listening in the morning. You can listen in the evening or whatever.
Right.
It's cool. So actually, we're running a little bit short on time here because
sure.
But do you have? You mentioned you had some questions for us. Do you have any offhand?
Well, just one thing that you guys mentioned. Well, one of the things that I don't know if it worries me or concerns me a little bit about the future of podcasting is when you go to certain categories, sports, for example, it's hard to find a sports podcast that's not ESPN. Or you go to a news and it's hard to find a news podcast that's not CNN, simply repurposed of CNN or the CBC for you or whoever it is. And it's hard in some of these categories. It's hard to find, I'm worried, even as much as we like, tech news today, or Twit, that, the network, you click on technology and they're dominant. And even in cases where you have, and I think this is a bit of a problem with the iTunes store, where you'll have a show, I guess, This Week in Tech will actually be 3 places in the top 10 because it's the audio version is there and the HD version and the video version. And so, and so you get, just wondering sort of, how you guys felt about sort of the professionalization of podcasting, competing against the CBC or network news or things that really aren't really podcasts. They're sort of just repurposed, the audio off of a news show or something like that. Well, and I don't want the again, I say the word amateur or hobbyist. I don't mean that in the negative way at all.
You're talking about like somebody who's really passionate about their niche market and is getting it out there
and
doing quality stuff, but getting squeezed out.
Yeah. I don't think people are going to get squeezed out. I think what you said, the keywords quirky and unusual, impassioned. You don't get that from radio. You get a guy that's his job, unless he's amazing at it. Like Howard Stern, even though he's incredibly obnoxious, he was impassioned about being a jerk. And that's what the entertainment was. He put 150% into the show. And I think a lot of podcasters put a lot of energy in it. And the listening audience likes that because that's what they don't get from the CNN reporters. Hi, I'm a talking head. I really don't know what I'm talking about. I'm reading from a screen. And people don't want to hear that. They want to hear a gut, like this is I'm impassioned about this, and this is why, and I'm going to ramble a little bit, and I'm going to drink a little beer. Well, that's entertainment, and it's real entertainment. And I don't think you get that from quote unquote professional broadcasters, because they're not allowed to be that way, because a bunch of lawyers and executives tell them they can't.
And
that's a great point.
But your point is well noted as well, and it's not that nothing to do with the content. It's more to do with the space, if you will, like in a grocery store, trying to get your awesome food product on the shelf is very difficult, because you have to pay this, Safeway or whatever, these huge fees to get it on the shelf. And that's where I think your question is heading in that direction, is are we going to in the future have to get past a gatekeeper and pay advertising fees to be in these podcatching directories? It's kind of like the corporatization of iTunes, let's say, or Zune or BlackBerry or wherever you're finding these podcasts. If these platforms become like the primary source of finding podcasts, I can see that being an issue, where you're only going to get in the search results, you're only going to get the CNNs and the CBCs and the really big podcasters, like in niche categories like technology with This Week in Tech. They're already there, so they're probably not going to go anywhere. But I totally do see that as a potential threat to the impassioned content out there. With the mass podcast producers out there just kind of being pushed down a little bit. But I don't think it's going to go anywhere, as long as people are able to search, do a Google search, or people will find good content, and it just kind of motivates all podcasters to bring their show up a notch, put more passion into it, and get some better equipment to sound, bring up their sound, and the cream will rise to the top, I think.
Yeah, and I think there's always going to be room for the niche, for the niche in terms of the the survey. I had great response from the role playing podcast community, gamers, and I didn't even know there were role playing game podcasts, and got great response from them, and from things like the comic book podcast community, which are extremely small niche shows, and obviously I think those will certainly continue. A big organization is not going to try to take on such a narrow, a real narrow niche. So I think, like you said, as long as podcasters sort of keep their identity and keep their niche, and as we said, be willing to, sort of band together as colleagues, and I certainly hope the future is bright. I think it probably is.
I think This Week in Tech, I think that we're chatting about as well. I think the only problem that could really come up is government wading in and saying, well, I think you guys need to be licensed, and having a license fiasco happen, and that could basically stop everything in its tracks. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, that's the government always messes things up. But on that note, I think we should call it a wrap. Great interview. Thank you for joining us. And
I really appreciate this, guys.
And thank you very much for listening to the Bunker Project and becoming our first maven, the research maven.
Big fan of the show.
Awesome. And,
excellent.
And although today we didn't, like you said in your email, we weren't drinking black beer, but we definitely were drinking black coffee during the show here.
Exactly.
All right.
Hey, thanks, guys. Awesome interview, Andrew, and Alan. You were a pleasure to listen to. It was actually, I was like biting my tongue, trying not to speak too much, and it was like listening to a podcast. It was great.
Well, it is a podcast. All right. Thanks a lot, Alan.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.